The first bus of the morning hissed like a tired dragon as Hollis eased it out of the depot and into the gray seam of dawn. He liked the hour before the city remembered itself, when streetlights still believed in the night and the cracked sidewalks held their breath. He flicked the wipers once, clearing a delicate gauze of mist from the windshield, and felt the ritual quiet settle into him. Mirrors checked, seat low, hands at 10 and 2. A thumb tap to the dash photo of his sister and her kid like a superstition no one knew about. Route 17 north, Riverside to the old shipyards. He'd run it enough to feel its timing in his bones, like a song he could hum with his eyes closed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. By the second stop, an aluminum shelter dented like a soda can, graffiti blooming on the plexiglass, Keir could tell it would be a wary morning. Fog stewed above the harbor, and the road's skin was oil slick from last night's drizzle. He favored a soft brake, letting the bus kneel with a sigh, doors yawning open to spill warm air onto the chill. A nurse with red indentations where her mask had lived all night stepped aboard, paid with a nod, and folded into a corner seat like a closing umbrella. Two high schoolers, earbuds corking their attention. A man in paint-spattered pants who always chose the same spot beside the middle doors and stared at his boots as if confession could be read there. Keir felt the timetable tick against his ribs. The city had laws written in seconds. Wait no longer than 20 at a stop. Never depart early. Keep the route's spine unbroken by improvisation. But humanity had customs too, and his were older. He learned them bussing tables in a diner, learned them driving his mother to late shifts, learned them watching his sister bring a baby into a world that didn't promise softness. He'd give time the way you split an orange, carefully, with both hands, when someone needed it. At Willow and 8th, he saw the biker. The figure came from the fog like a note held too long on a saxophone, thinned, aching, then suddenly loud. Leather jacket dulled by weather, jeans torn not in fashion, but in consequence. The limp was real in the way pain rewrites a person's geometry, left leg dragging, right shoulder compensating. He wasn't astride his machine, he was pushing it. A matte black motorcycle with the broadened chest of a tank and one mirror taped up. The bike coughed when he nudged the starter, then settled into a defeated silence. The man's breath ghosted. The bus's hazard lights clicked, that metronome that always made Keir feel monitored. He was 10 seconds early, rare as a blue moon. That meant a sanctioned pause, but what he needed wasn't sanction. It was a choice. "Buddy, you boarding or—" Keir called through the door gap, voice careful not to sound like he was hurrying a man already being hurried by the world. The biker looked up. His beard showed salt at the edges. His eyes were a blue you see only in cold water. He measured the steps, the bike, his leg, the morning, then shook his head once embarrassed, as if the refusal itself were an apology. "Go on. Don't hold for me." Keir thumbed the kneel anyway. "You paying cash or card?" The smallest lift at the corner of the man's mouth at the absurdity of it. "Card," he said after a beat. He left the motorcycle like a dog told to stay and limped the distance across wet asphalt with that crushed ankle shuffle that Keir knew everything he needed to know about how much it cost to move today. Keir tapped his own employee pass to cover the fare before the man could fumble for a wallet. He heard the soft beep and felt the illicit pleasure of it, the petty rebellion of kindness.
"Route 17, Keir said. "We'll get you near Riverside Garage. There's a shop on Dunlop, opens at 9. The man wrapped cool hands around the farebox rail. Up close, he smelled of machine oil and weather. "Name's Rhett," he said. Not offered like a handshake, more like a fact he was willing to let be known. "Keir." Rhett's gaze scanned the empty seats, caught on the nurse, the kids, the painter. He chose to stand, bracing in the aisle, like sitting would be conceding too much to pain. He leaned his head into the pole, closed his eyes, in a way that wasn't sleep, but was an agreement with gravity. Keir watched the mirror. He always did. Practiced at seeing without staring. The bike hunched back at the curb like a forgotten animal. He felt the seconds climb off the timetable and onto his neck. 20 seconds became 30. 30 became 40. He should go. He should. He didn't. He waited while Rhett's breath evened, while the bus's air system cycled with the sound of a conch shell, while the fog unrolled a little farther down the block. He waited until a city truck behind him honked a half-hearted complaint and reality reasserted itself. Then he lifted the kneel, closed the doors, and feathered the accelerator so the bus translated its tonnage into forward without complaint. At Peninsula, he got the text. Supervisors lived in phones like weather lives in clouds, inevitable, unfeeling. Hollis, 17 North, late at Willow and 8th. See me end of shift. Miss Pennington always used punctuation like a weapon. Periods were bullets. Keir let the screen go dark and took the corner at a grandmotherly pace. He felt something familiar about the whole morning, like the city had set a table for a conversation it had been avoiding, and he was being asked to sit first. By Peninsula Market, a few more boarded. An old man who pretended not to need the ramp and then thanked Keir under his breath when Keir put it down anyway. A grad student with hair like an unmade bed and a potted plant he cradled like an infant. Loud sneakers squeak at every braking. Everyone carried their own personal weather. Keir felt like the forecaster, translating barometers into kindness where he could. Rhett stood without asking when the old man needed the priority seats. He shifted his weight with a wince he failed to hide. Keir caught the move in the mirror and filed it under Men Who Believe Hurts Are Secrets. He'd met that file before. They made Peninsula District in a long exhale of road. The fog began to take a step back from the day. Keir signaled, merged around a delivery truck that had decided the red zone was a suggestion. He watched a cyclist slice too close and made space with a small steering correction nobody else felt. His attention was a net. He cast it wide. Rhett said, "Drop me at Dunlop." "It's 2 blocks off route," Keir said. Automatic as prayer. "There's a stop at Mercer, you can—" "It's fine," Rhett said, like it obviously wasn't. Keir glanced at the timetable, at the next stop, at the small, aching arithmetic of minutes and mercy. Mercer had a broken curb and a puddle that would take a submarine. Dunlop had a bench under an overhang and a mechanic who kept hot coffee on a back burner. Keir was a kid who learned the bus map by where the benches were when the rain came sideways.
He made a decision and felt his body accept it, like a second heart starting up. He added the turn signal he wasn't supposed to add. He crept the bus around the corner like a guilty thing that had decided to be brave. People looked up. Passengers, pedestrians, because a bus where a bus did not belong is a creature out of habitat. He laid the bus against the curb at Dunlap as if he'd been parking there his whole life. "Appreciate it," Rhett said. The words were sanded down to their irreducible core. He stepped off, shoulders hunched against the damp. Keir watched him limp through the shop door and be received by a bell and a voice he couldn't hear. He pulled away with that feeling that always followed a small defiance. Light, sharp, like a laugh you haven't decided whether you're allowed to keep. The write-up came at noon. In the depot office that smelled of burnt coffee and tired intentions, Miss Pennington delivered it with ritual solemnity. "We have schedules for a reason, Hollis," she said, pale lipstick cracking where the corners of her mouth dragged down. She was not cruel, merely translated. She spoke management as a first language. Passengers depend on predictability. "Passengers depend on decency, too," he said, surprising himself with the heat in it. She set the paper between them like a treaty. "I depend on you to do both." That night, he sat at his small kitchen table listening to the radiator gossip with the window glass about winter and filled the sink with soapy water to drown the day. He ate standing up, as if sitting might invite a kind of thinking he wasn't ready for. He watched a short clip on his phone of a bus in Mumbai threading a flood like a needle, passengers laughing because their feet were in river water and there was nothing to be done but be alive together. He clicked it off before the algorithm decided he liked floods. When morning came again, the fog had grown teeth. Keir took Route 17 out like an apology and a promise braided together. At Willow and 8th, the shelter wore new graffiti. A crown, a name that was probably a name, a cartoon octopus he grudgingly admired. The motorcycle wasn't there. He felt a nudge of disappointment he scolded himself for. What had he expected? That a man's need would keep making itself available so he could perform decency at it? He was early again. He was almost never early. The sound arrived before the sight. A low, synchronized thunder rolling up from the river like the city had invented weather with engines. Keir's hands tightened on the wheel. A line of motorcycles appeared, pairing off, forming twos and twos, light halos punching holes in fog. They slowed as one organism, a school of fish and leather, and took the curb lane. The lead rider lifted 2 fingers in a salute that was somehow both casual and ceremonial. Rhett was in the third pair. He wasn't limping now, the bike did the walking. Up close, the patchwork on his back wrote itself in thread, letters that made a kind of myth in the public imagination, the kind that terrified some and romanticized others because true things are complicated. Keir's stomach sank and rose in the same movement. He knew enough to know you didn't know enough. Outlaw club, charity ride, brotherhood, headlines, funeral processions that stop traffic, toys for tots drives that fill a gymnasium, men who had done bad and men who had done good, and men who were both, depending on the year. He felt all of that pass through him like weather.
The riders fanned out around the bus with the choreography of experience. 2 took the lead, 2 took the flank, 1 drifted back like a shepherd dog. Keir looked at the mare, at the passengers, the nurse's eyes widening, the kids lifting phones, the painter's mouth forming a word he did not say. The city truck behind them disappeared in the disciplined wake of engines. Keir opened the doors and leaned slightly towards Rhett across the threshold of machine and machine. You lose a bet? It was a thin joke, the kind you offered to see what shape the morning is going to take. Rhett's eyes had the same cold water blue. We're riding your route, he said simply. You and... Keir counted and gave up. All your cousins? Something like family, Rhett said. You waited. He said it like a diagnosis rather than a compliment. From that morning, the bus had company. The ritual revealed itself slowly. The bikes would collect at Willow and 8th like weather gathers on a horizon. They'd take positions without fuss, without formal introduction, as if the road itself had invited them to act as ribs around a soft organ. When delivery vans crowded the lane with hazard lights announcing selfishness, the lead riders created space. When a sedan dove in front of the bus at the last second like a bored teenager challenging physics, the flank rider made room where no room had been. When a crosswalk filled with people and the timing got ugly, when a cyclist wobbled because his backpack threw him off center of gravity, when a car door popped open without warning, each time the motorcycles translated chaos into choreography. Passengers developed opinions. They always do. A barista with freckles like constellations declared them the breaks with beards. The kids filmed, edited, added music, made short clips that fluttered between phones like paper birds. A woman from the church at Halcyon Street crossed herself every time the convoy appeared and then relaxed into a smile she never otherwise let the bus see. The old man who pretended not to need the ramp started telling stories about riding in the 60s like he'd been waiting for the permission of exhaust to unlock memory. Keir kept driving. He didn't speak about the convoy unless spoken to. He didn't call them anything. He let the afternoon dispatcher crackle in his ear about schedule adherence and answered with the numbers that meant yes, on time, yes, we're moving,
Yes, I am a responsible man in a big vehicle. There were nights he wondered what the cost was, what kindness owed when it accrued interest. He let that thought sit in the chair across from him and not finish its drink. The city noticed, because a city is a creature whose eyes are everywhere. A news van idled along the route one morning, its antenna like a curiosity-driven antennae of a beetle. A reporter with hair that could cut bread interviewed the churchwoman at Halcyon who said, "They make me feel safe, and that's a blessing," which wasn't the story the station wanted, but was a story nonetheless. The clip showed Keir's bus gliding through a construction choke point with motorcycles forming a human zipper, and the comments did what comments do. Turned the world into a chorus of arguments sung from couches. At the depot, a memo appeared with the nervous language of lawyers hiding under the desk of public relations. Operators are reminded that cooperation with non-city vehicles is neither encouraged nor discouraged. Safety remains paramount. Any incidents should be reported immediately. It was the kind of document that thrust both hands out to say it was innocent. Miss Pennington called Keir in with her careful face on. "You are not to coordinate with them," she said, a pronoun hanging in the air like a chandelier. "You are not to solicit their assistance." "I don't," Keir said. "They just show up." "Things that just show up rarely stay casual," she said. He thought about that as he watched fog become rain, become steam off warmed asphalt. He saw Rhett in fragments. A nod at dawn, a hand lifted as if to test the height of the morning. Once, at Dunlap, a paper cup of coffee held out without comment and accepted without speech. He learned the rhythm of Rhett's throttle, like he learned the breaths of his passengers, who needed what, when. He learned the way Rhett took curves with his weight low, the way he drifted near the bus's front quarter panel when Keir had to change lanes, a steel guardian angel playing geometry with traffic. He did not ask what the patches meant. He did not ask about bylaws or brotherhood or the past written on knuckles. People are maps. If you care enough, they will tell you how to read them when you are ready. On a Tuesday, slick with more drizzle than weather, conflict arrived in the shape of a small man with a large mouth at the harbor market stop. He boarded fast and loud, already mid-argument with someone on the other end of his cheap phone, sentences ricocheting like ball bearings. He refused to move his backpack, sat in the priority area, and pretended not to see the woman with the cane. Keir did what he always did. A gentle voice, an appeal to shared decency. But the man was made of batteries and wire, sparks where kindness should be. He said words you generally say for when you want a fight to bring friends. Rhett watched from the curb. Keir felt the knowledge of it without seeing him. The rider's posture changed by degrees. Not interference, not yet. Keir breathed deep, found the tone that made most people remember they were once children who wanted gold stars. And the man rolled his eyes and moved the backpack with a theater of martyrdom. The woman sat. The world resumed. At Mercer, a white pickup tried to pass on the right, where right did not exist. It nosed into the bus's blind spot like a thought you don't want to have. Rhett's flank rider was there, a wall of leather and steel, a mirror full of patience, and the pickup found itself confronted with consequence. It fell back. Its driver made a point of educating everyone within earshot about his opinion of motorcycles, then accelerated away in a fury that looked like loneliness had finally found its car. Keir went home with his heart tired but measurable. He texted his sister a photo of a seagull standing like a tiny pope on the depot fence. She sent back a photo of her kid's shoelaces in a catastrophic double knot, and the world made enough sense to keep. By Friday, the convoy had doubled. You don't count motorcycles the way you count cars. They are their own mathematics. 2 by 2, filling space without greed, talking to one another in the language of turn signals and posture. People on sidewalks smiled the way you smile at parades you didn't plan to attend. Mothers held kids' hands a little tighter because big noise is big noise, even when it's orchestrated. Keir thought about the phrase outlaw and felt the way language is a coat that sometimes hides the shape of the body underneath. That afternoon, the storm finally gathered the courage to be itself. Rain came in honest sheets that simplified the city's palette to wet concrete and the glow of brake lights. The convoy's taillights stitched a red seam through the downpour. The bus's wipers labored. The heater's breath fogged the interior glass in the first 2 rows where cold passengers exhaled their relief. The road served up its threats like a lazy dealer who still has the power to ruin your night.
Keir's attention stretched thin and stayed unbroken. He didn't notice at first that the bus's brake pedal had gone from the resistance of a firm handshake to the give of a damp sponge until he needed it to be what it had always been. He pumped once. The pedal sulked. The bus slowed, but not with the righteous certainty he expected. He added distance like a miser stacks coins. At the shipyards, a detour appeared like a dare. A barricade where none had been that morning. A big orange drum wearing a reflective vest. A sign that said, "Road closed," as if the road might argue. Flooding ahead, a cop in a rain slicker waved traffic into a lane that had been a shoulder last week, and a rumor the week before. The convoy compressed and expanded to accommodate. Easy, Keir told himself, the word more inhaled than sound. From the mirror, he saw Rhett look back. Ryder's radar pinging something amiss that no instrument had measured. Men who live around machines develop a sixth sense for when they're being lied to by metal. Rhett made a hand motion low and tight. Close ranks, keep the lane. They crawled the detour like a centipede negotiating a crack in the sidewalk. A semi-truck, long as a decision you postponed too long, came the other way, misjudged the turn, and claimed more of the road than it had paid for. The bus had nowhere to go but narrower. The motorcycles tightened, buffers compressing, a rushing half-inch of safety built and rebuilt every second. The brakes betrayed him then. A downhill grade, mild but meaningful, conspired with slick paint and water that pretended to be road and wasn't. Keir pressed the pedal and felt it behave like a stranger at his door, present but not forthcoming. The bus continued to roll when stopping had been both plan and promise. The semi's trailer slid a fraction like the idea of jackknifing had flirted and then thought better of it. Rhett's hand shot up, a signal Keir did not know he knew how to read until his body obeyed it. Downshift, use the engine. He dropped a gear, listened to the diesel growl, felt the drag of compression do what the brakes could not. The bus moaned, slowed, found its honesty again. They reached Dunlop and Keir put the bus to the curb with a prayer and muscle memory. The passengers clapped the way people clap for a pilot who lands in wind shears, a mixture of gratitude and relief and the need to do something with adrenaline. Keir didn't turn around. He kept his hands on the wheel and counted to 20 because counting is a religion when you need one.
Rhett knocked twice on the door, a polite shorthand that carried through rain like code. Keir cracked the doors and kept his voice true. "Brakes are soft," he said. "Smelled it," Rhett said. "You cooking pads?" "I think the lines are wet and tired and lying to me." "Depot? 2 miles." Rhett didn't nod. He did a thing that wasn't nodding but had the same meaning, a small adjustment of shoulders that said, received, understood, carried. He turned to the convoy and made a circle motion with his hand. The bikes heeled on their stands, men swung legs over. The rain was a third presence in every sentence. Rhett put 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled, not movie loud, just enough to gather attention. He pointed at Keir, then at the road, then at the depot, and then he did the gesture that meant we make a box around him and we take him home. Keir pulled out like he'd been granted an honor he hadn't asked for and now had to bear with grace. The convoy built a moving fortress. 2 riders ahead, 2 behind, 2 right at his flanks, the rest flexible air in the larger shape. Cars behind them made decisions based on the old calculus of courage and noise. Most waited. A few tried to dart and then thought better. The rain applauded their stubbornness on the bus's windshield. They made the depot. Mechanics met them with rags and competence. The bus shuddered to a stop like a dog that's just remembered all the tricks it's supposed to know. Keir breathed out long and let the engine wind down. Rhett stood in the doorway, helmet in the cup of his arm, hair plastered to his head in a way that made him look suddenly young and very mortal. He didn't say, "You're welcome," and didn't need to. "You didn't have to either," Keir said, meaning more than what the sentence contained. Rhett's mouth twitched. "You didn't have to either," he said, and meant the first morning, the extra seconds, the quiet rebellion of a kneeling bus. Pennington came out then, raincoat on, a clipboard doing its fantasy of power. She looked from motorcycles to Keir, to the mechanics working like hands in a single pair of gloves. Her mouth thinned. She was calculating liability the way other people count rosary beads. She said, "We'll file an incident report. I'll need statements." "Give her the truth," Rhett said low, "that you got home safe because you did what the road asked." Keir thought of all the things he wanted to say. That incident was a poor word for a morning where people behaved like they were responsible for one another. That report was too small a box to hold what it felt like to be escorted through storm by men who were worse and better than their reputation, depending on the decade you chose to look at it. He said none of it. He nodded and reached for the pen. That night, the video went loud. It wasn't Keir's doing. Someone had stood under the awning at the shipyard detour and filmed the convoy shepherding the bus like a fragile animal across a busy stream. The caption tried to be funny, failed, then became sincere in the comments where people told stories about being helped on highways by men with patches and men without, about kindness in unlikely uniforms. The algorithm, that fickle god, smiled for a minute. The number ticked upward, and people began to recognize the bus in it. Keir's phone tried to be a celebration, an accusation. He turned it face down because light at 2 a.m. can feel like judgment. He woke to a text from his sister, 3 fireworks emojis, and "My brother's a hero?" with a question mark that meant she knew he'd hate the word. He wrote back, "No heroes on buses, only people who try." She sent a heart, which is the only reply you can send to that. By Monday, the convoy was not a novelty. It was a fact. 200 motorcycles look like a lot, until you see what they can do with space. They moved like choreography had been built into their bones. They didn't block so much as choreograph, their presence an argument for cooperation. People on sidewalks did not hide their children. Children pointed and smiled and asked questions that made their mothers laugh.
A city councilman asked to ride the route. He wore a suit that tried to be brave. He smiled with too many teeth and took photos like proof. Keir let him. Everyone needs to feel like they are part of the solution sometimes. On Wednesday, Miss Pennington placed another memo, this one resigned in tone. Operators are reminded to maintain professionalism during increased public attention. Deviation from route is prohibited without dispatch approval. It was the system's way of saying, be extraordinary, but only in ordinary ways. That afternoon, Keir and Rhett exchanged their longest conversation to date, which wasn't long. It happened at Dunlop while the mechanic rinsed brake dust from his hands and the rain decided to be mist again. "You ride because," Keir asked, and left the blank a space big enough to fit the honest answer or a lie, whichever the man needed to set down. Rhett looked past him to where children were walking their sneakers along the curb like a balance beam. "Because the world is louder than me," he said finally. "On a bike, I can hear my thoughts if I chase them." "Leg?" Keir asked, instinctively rubbing his own knee as if empathy had tendons. "Old story. New weather. It barks when rain's coming. It howled the day you waited. Felt stupid being slow, owing a stranger 50 seconds for dignity." "I had them," Keir said. "The seconds. They were mine to spend." Rhett's mouth did that almost smile again. "Most people hoard the small bills," he said. A woman from the harbor market stop, she of the cane, appeared with a Tupperware of cookies wrapped in a towel to keep them warm. She looked at Rhett's chest like she was reading runes and decided to look at his face instead. "For the road," she said. Rhett took one like he was being knighted. Things that look like violence from far away often look like gratitude up close. News found a new angle by Thursday: liability. A talking head asked about jurisdiction, about escorts and city policy, about what happens when kindness and regulation shake hands and discover they've got different kinds of risks. Keir watched the segment with the sound off, while a little boy on the bus explained to his grandmother the difference between a cruiser and a sport bike with an authority only 8-year-olds possess. He told Miss Pennington, "If it stops being safe, I'll tell them to go." And she said, "And if they don't?" And he said, "Then I'll still go, on my route, the way I always do." They looked at each other over the gulf that exists between a person paid to stop accidents and a person paid to keep things moving. They both believed themselves to be right. They both were. The first real consequence arrived in steel. A construction company with a reputation for asking the road to forgive too much had decided to stage a crane at Riverside at 4 p.m., which is a time the city reserves for orchestra work, violins of brakes, timpani of trucks, woodwinds of pedestrians. The crane owner had secured a permit that at some point had been a paper, and then a stamp, and then a shrugged yes. The detour pushed buses into a lane that had been invented an hour earlier by paint that pretended to be dry. Keir approached with the acceptance of a man who often encountered decisions he didn't get to vote on. The convoy gathered itself like muscles bracing. A dump truck whose driver had collected far too many bad mornings tailgated the bus with a kind of insistence that confusion mistakes for courage. A horn blared not an alarm, but as punctuation to a sentence that had no verb. Rhett pushed forward and made space the dump truck could understand. The driver accelerated into that space as if the universe owed him forward motion. He hadn't planned beyond the acceleration. The convoy flexed, absorbed, translated. Keir flattened his foot on the brake, felt resistance this time. The mechanics had bled the lines and restored trust, and kept the bus exactly where it needed to be. It should have been a near miss that became a story later over coffee about idiots and saviors. It would have been, if not for the van. A white delivery van with a logo that said some company name that had almost certainly changed hands twice and meant nothing to the man inside, decided to avoid the entire scenario by making a lane between the bus and a row of orange drums that were already suffering for the city. The van clipped a drum. The drum kissed the bus with an orange bruise. The van overcorrected. The windshield became a screen where futures played and were canceled and were rewritten in a heartbeat. Keir's hands locked, then softened. Too tight is as dangerous as too loose. Rhett moved into the emergency margin, a space that exists only if you build it with anticipation. A rider at the bus's rear tapped his brake twice, a signal traveling backwards through men who read light-like language, and the tail of the convoy slurred to a slower tempo. The van slid. The world held its breath, like a theater realizing the next line had been forgotten and waiting to see who would improvise. Keir saw a school crossing sign ahead, stick figures forever moving toward a future. Saw a spray of rain on the street that made halos under the headlights. Saw his own reflection in the windshield, a man who wanted to be the kind of person who spent seconds well. The van's grille filled his view, inches from the glass, and the horn became a long, mindless scream. The bus's engine growled. The convoy's red taillights burned like a lit fuse. And then the road rose up under them like a lifting stage. The bus pitched, the horn sharpened into a blade, and the white of the van became the only color in the world.
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. The van's tires finally found something like grip. It wasn't grace. It was friction doing ugly work. The white nose slewed past the bus's windshield, close enough that Keir saw a paper coffee cup pirouette in the passenger footwell and lodge against the firewall. He heard the bark of a side mirror snapping somewhere near his left ear, a gunshot made of plastic. The bus's engine braking held like a friend gripping your elbow at a curb. Keir kept his hands soft because the wheel punishes panic. The van skated along the row of drums, then kissed a sawhorse, then settled crooked across the lane, its hazard lights throwing up their hands after the fact. The red tail lights of the convoy made a stitched line through the gray, like somebody had finally remembered to hem the day. The van driver blinked himself back toward language. I didn't see the... His throat tripped. Sorry. I'm sorry. Rain lies, Rhett said. He reached in and turned the key to off. You're going to sit tight a minute. EMTs will want to prod your pride and make sure it still works. Keir stepped down into puddles that reflected nothing but brake lights and sky. His shoes gulped water. He and Rhett looked at each other across the van's hood. No fist bumps, no applause. Just that tilt of mutual assessment that says, both here, continue.
Cops arrived wearing rain that made everyone equal. The first officer took in the motorcycles, the bus, the tilted van, and his face did the math. He chose the tone of sensible adult. Nobody moves until we write our names on the day, he said, more to the weather than to them. He pointed. You, to Keir. Statement. You, to Rhett, a narrower measure in his voice. Don't go improvising. Rhett smiled with only one corner of his mouth. We like sheet music, he said, which made the officer's ears pink, because he realized maybe he'd come prepared for a concert and found a rehearsal instead. They cleared it. The van limped to the shoulder, the drums were set upright like soldiers who'd taken a knee and remembered formation, and the bus exhaled 2 stops worth of patience and resumed being a public living room on wheels. The convoy flowed back into its old choreography, as if the interruption had been a bridge in the song, and now they were returning to the chorus. Keir's hands were steady again by Halcyon. The cane woman reached the door and paused. That was decent, she said, as if she were grading a paper and finding, to her surprise, an A- she wouldn't have to defend. Still on schedule, Keir said, and she laughed, and the day forgave itself a little. The video of the near miss traveled faster than rain. Comment sections found their 2 poles, as they always do. This is why you never let anyone do anything, and this is what happens when people don't wait for permission to be decent. Keir did not feed either pole. He fed himself toast, and then he sat on his couch while his radiator made ghost noises, and he watched the ceiling until it began to look like a map of a place he might want to go. The convoy returned the next day not as a victory lap, but as a continuation. 200 riders is a headline. 200 riders who show up again is a decision. They arrived with the same low thunder, the same economy of motion. Keir realized he'd learned their sounds, the dry clatter of a loose chain a few bikes back, the deeper note of a big twin in the lead, the high saw of a sport bike that always hung at the rear like a kid who wants to see how far he can stretch the rubber band without snapping it. He stopped thinking of them as armor. Armor is for battle. This felt closer to choreography that refuses to let any one dancer fall. Miss Pennington called him in at lunch with a face that left her clipboard at home. She said, "They're asking for a statement. Communications wants a quote from the operator. We can give them generic, or we can give you." He stared at the coffee mug with the depot's logo that had been through a dishwasher so many times the letters were a rumor. What do we say? That your focus is safety, she said. That you didn't ask for an escort, that you appreciate the community looking out for one another, but you can't endorse or coordinate. She lifted her eyes. That last part is the lawyers. The first part is me. He imagined the quote floating in the newsfeed like a polite leaf carried by a river. He imagined it doing no harm and no good. He said finally, "Say I'm grateful we got home safe. Say that's the only story I know how to tell." She nodded, and something in her shoulders eased. "That's a good sentence," she said. "We can use that." The days stacked like plates in the diner. Useful, a little chipped, familiar. The convoy became part of the route the way a shadow belongs to a body. Passengers stopped filming and started planning their mornings around the low thunder. A kid in a Spider-Man hoodie asked, loudly and with reverence, "Are they superheroes?" And his grandmother said, "They're neighbors." And Keir wanted to put that on a billboard over every highway in the county.
He and Rhett added to their small vocabulary. A nod when Keir saw him stretch the bad leg at a red light. A hand to the heart when a driver did something dumb and nobody paid the price. Once, a conversation that nearly cracked open into biography and then retreated, like shy weather. "Those patches," Keir said, carefully. Not curious for gossip, but curious for context. They mean what people think? They mean belonging, mostly, Rhett said. He watched a gull argue with a French fry on the sidewalk. They mean I don't have to explain the worst day I ever had to men who had their own. And the other days? They mean Friday night rides to nowhere in particular. They mean funerals we don't miss. They mean you can't lie to the mirror. He lifted his chin toward the bus. They mean when a man gives you 15 seconds that let you keep some pride on a bad morning, you don't forget it. Keir watched rain drill a neat row of dots across the top of the windshield, like a sentence learned in Morse years ago. 50 seconds, he corrected. Rhett's mouth twitched. Inflation, he said. The city council scheduled a hearing the way cities do when something unregulated refuses to stay small. Public comments regarding non-governmental traffic escorts and roadway safety. It sounded like a seminar people would attend for the Danish and leave before the questions. It filled to standing room. Bikers in clean leathers sat beside church ladies in clean cardigans. Mechanics stood beside office clerks who had started riding Route 17 because community feels different when you can hear it. Keir didn't intend to speak. He came because Ms. Pennington asked him to, and because he had learned that sometimes the easiest way to keep a story from becoming an untruth is to sit in the room where it is being told. He took a seat by the aisle and let his hands remember the shape of a steering wheel while other people spoke words into microphones that made them sound like they were addressing a jury. A businessman with silver hair said words like precedent and liability, and someone behind Keir tutted softly, not out of rudeness, but out of weariness. A woman from the Harbor Market congregation used the word blessing again, her voice finding its strength as it crossed the space between her chest and the microphones. A young man with a skateboard at his feet said he'd stopped getting buzzed by SUVs while riding to class when the convoy was present, and he preferred not being a hood ornament. When they called Keir's name, he stood as if the floor had given him a nudge. He touched the edge of the wood lectern as if checking its finish. I drive a bus. My job is to carry strangers from where they are to where they need to be. Most days, that means schedules and mirrors and patience. Some days, it means rain makes a fool out of the road, and people who don't have to help show up anyway. He looked not at the council, but at the faces behind them, those indirect witnesses who matter more because they might ride tomorrow. I didn't ask for an escort. They chose to ride my route. They don't ask me to change what I do. They just fold themselves into the city in a way that makes reckless people think twice. We got home safe on a day we might not have. That's the story I have. A councilman asked gently, "Do you coordinate?" Keir shook his head. I drive, they ride. The road does the rest. Outside on the steps, microphones waited, like small birds with their beaks open to be fed. Keir waved them off. Rhett leaned against a railing, weight balanced to give the leg its way. You looked like you were delivering a eulogy for common sense. Sometimes it feels dead, Keir said. We keep it on life support, he said. That's the job. What changed after the hearing was not policy so much as posture. The police cruisers that had been patrolling the route with curiosity began to move with intention. Officers would roll down windows at Willow and 8th and say, "Let's keep it clean." And then they would watch with the expression of chaperones at a dance who remember when they liked to dance. The convoy adjusted to the new observer, a creature their wilderness had acquired that could become friend or foe, depending on whether it felt respected.
The real test came on a Tuesday that wore sunshine like a disguise. Everything looked easy until it wasn't. A driver in a sedan impatient in the way people get when their morning has insulted them 3 times before coffee, tried to slingshot past the bus at Camden where the lanes pinch. He cut hard, saw a narrowing that was not a rumor but a fact, and jerked left. In doing so, he clipped the front wheel of a cyclist whose bike was the thing that kept his body honest. The cyclist pinwheeled, hit the deck on his shoulder, slid. The sedan braked, thought about fleeing, remembered phones have eyes, and froze. Keir's body did what long practice taught it. He stopped the bus with a smoothness that kept the standing passengers on their feet. He hit the hazards. He was already out of the seat when he realized he didn't need to yell, because the convoy had already become architecture. 2 riders were at the cyclist, one kneeling, one unfurling a bandana that became a sling. Another directed cars away with a polite but uncompromising palm. Rhett stood at the sedan's window, not threatening, because threat is a small tool, but absolute. He gestured and the driver killed the engine, turned off the music that had been telling him he was the protagonist, and put his hands on the wheel. The cyclist groaned, rolled to a sit with assistance, swore benignly to prove he was alive. "Shoulder," he said through his teeth. "She's mad." "Let her be," the kneeling rider said. "Angry shoulders have their reasons." He moved competent fingers along collarbone and scapula, checking for deformity. An ambulance came with that swift resignation ambulances have when the city won't stop providing it with work. They loaded the cyclist with a promise about x-rays and a lecture about helmets delivered politely because the patient was wearing one. The sedan driver cried, the kind of tear that comes when the adrenaline bill is presented. Rhett let him, and then he said, "Call your insurance. Don't lie." The man nodded because that's what you do when a stranger commands you to be honest in a way that might save you from a worse self. Keir climbed back into his seat and felt his hands shake only after the bus was rolling. He breathed the way his sister's yoga app taught him once when he was making fun of it, and then found it useful. 4 in, hold, 6 out, repeat until the math calms the blood. Riverside applauded when they arrived like they were a band that had managed to stick the landing on a difficult song. Keir bowed his head without meaning to. Gratitude makes you shy if you weren't looking for it. The next morning, a cardboard sign appeared at Willow and 8th, zip-tied to the shelter frame. The handwriting tried to be neat and failed nobly. "Thank you for looking out for us, by Route 17. Someone had drawn a bus with a smiling face, because some people still believe objects might like us if we treat them kindly. Someone had drawn a motorcycle with a tiny cape, because children live among us and are paying attention. Keir found himself thinking often of seconds, how they behave when you hoard them, how they multiply when you spend them right. He began to notice the places along the route where time pooled, the extra breath before a light turned green, the hesitation in a driver's eyes that foretell a lane change, the way pedestrians negotiate space with one another using tiny nods and shrugs like geese arranging themselves before flight. On a Friday that smelled of hot brakes and pretzels from a cart, Miss Pennington found him leaning against the side of his bus between runs, eyes closed to make more room for hearing. "You've started listening to the city breathe," she said. "I think it snores," he said, and she surprised him by laughing in a way that made her look 10 years younger. "I got a call from the deputy mayor. He would appreciate it if the escorts could keep things tidy for the next couple of weeks while they pretend to make a policy. His word was de-escalation. My word is don't scare the horses. I don't coordinate."
"I know," she said, "but if you happen to mention, as a private citizen on your own time, that the city enjoys not being sued, I'll owe you a coffee." Keir didn't have a bat signal. What he had was Dunlop. He found Rhett there in the late afternoon sunlight that makes even greasy tools look like family heirlooms. The garage smelled like oil and redemption. "They want you to be quiet while they think," Keir said. Rhett wiped his hands on a rag that had known many days. "We can hum," he said. "We don't have to be a marching band." He gestured toward a stool. Keir sat. The conversation decided to be bigger. "You always ride?"
Or do you ever stop? I used to stop. Stopping turned out to be harder. He propped the bad leg on a milk crate. When I'm moving, the noise outside drowns the noise inside. On the mornings I don't ride, I hear too much of both. You got anyone, Keir started, then edited himself, who waits for you to come home? Rhett considered the ceiling. A brother who calls from Houston every third Sunday, a dog with a grudge against squirrels, a club that will notice if I don't show up to argue about why the coffee tastes like road tar. He glanced at Keir. You? Sister? A kid who used to be a noise and is becoming a person. He smiled. A bus. And a city that I love most when it's not trying to prove itself. They were quiet together without awkwardness, the way men are when they remember that silence isn't a problem to be solved. The next test came without rain, without detours. It came with a sound. Keir heard it before he knew what it meant. A metallic scream you only hear when something heavy is being forced to do something it wasn't built for. The overpass at Camden had been complaining to the department for years in letters that sounded like engineering. That day, it decided to stop negotiating. A chunk of its underside gave way with the sigh of old concrete, and a shower of gravel and rebar teeth fell into the lane like the sky had dandruff with teeth. Keir was 3 buses back. The convoy had already flexed to create room when the first chunk dropped. A rider in the lead, helmet with a lightning bolt sticker, threw up his hand and the whole organism slowed as if a single brake lever had been pulled. Cars without that extra layer of attention reacted late, then overreacted. Horns spoke without saying anything useful. A slab fell. It hit the hood of a sedan 2 vehicles ahead of Keir with a depressing physics. The sedan buckled like paper. The driver's hands flew to her face and then back to the wheel, because autopilot doesn't let go easily. Keir had time to be grateful for his brake maintenance and for the day being dry. He brought the bus to a stop that felt like landing instead of colliding. He was out of his seat before the world had finished rebounding. Rhett was already up there, because of course he was. He gestured riders into positions that made a pattern only men who live at the intersection of risk and responsibility can make on the fly. 2 guarded the underpass's mouth with their bikes angled to deflect. 1 sprinted up the embankment toward the origin of the crumble, phone already at his ear summoning a shutdown that could be ordered only by people with radios as big as their certainties. Keir reached the sedan. The driver was crying and also apologizing, an emotional multitask no one should be asked to perform. "You're okay," Keir said, meaning alive, meaning present, meaning known. "We're going to walk away from this part." He and a rider in a bright yellow rain jacket that wasn't ironic got the door open. Seatbelt unclicked. The world narrowed to the geometry of a human exiting a space that had been deformed into rudeness. The driver stood, realized she was standing, and then trembled like an aftershock.
Police tape appeared as if grown from the ground. Officers closed the overpass with the grim efficiency of people who have to do this sort of thing more often than taxpayers think. The city turned a failure into a process within 8 minutes, which is a kind of grace rarely applauded. Keir returned to his bus with dust on his shoulders. The passenger smiled at him the way people smile at the version of you that showed up, instead of the one who might have panicked. No one asked for refunds. The grad student tended the plant with the kind of tenderness that suggests practicing for bigger care. That evening, the deputy mayor stood in front of cameras and used the phrase public-private partnership incorrectly to describe what was happening between a municipal bus route and 200 men on motorcycles who had decided to place themselves between carelessness and consequences. The next morning, a single patrol car waited at Willow and 8th and trailed the convoy at a respectful distance with its lights off, the way a father trails a toddler at a playground, prepared, hoping not to be needed. Rhett showed Keir a text thread on his phone at Dunlop that afternoon, the way you show someone a good joke. It was the club chat. A flurry of messages. Remember signal discipline.
No lane splitting unless needed. No eyeballing cagers. Helmets on. No revving like idiots. We're guests. Respect the bus's space. An officer had added with a wry grin made of words, "If you're gonna break hearts, do it with courtesy." Keir laughed until he surprised himself and felt a piece of a wall inside him lower. They built a rhythm. Morning, gather, ride, watch. Afternoon, stretch, repair. Compare notes in 3-word sentences men used to talk about feelings by talking about mechanics. Sometimes there was coffee. Once there were donuts, and Rhett claimed the maple bar with an efficiency that suggested prior steaks. Keir found himself changed in the small ways that matter most over time. He watched the mirrors differently, not more nervously, but more widely. He learned to anticipate the exact moment a merging car would realize it had run out of lane and shame, and he learned to make space a fraction before the driver knew to ask. He noticed the way a passenger would tense just before the bus pulled to the curb at their stop, and learned to feather the brake that much earlier. He became a better version of a job most people take for granted. One evening, when the light turned syrup and the gulls were tired of arguing, Keir parked the bus and walked to the seawall. Red limped up beside him without fanfare. They stood there, pretending not to be grateful for one another's company. "You know what I thought the first time you waited?" Red asked, eyes on the water. "That I'd cost you pride," Keir said. "That I was tired of being the kind of story people tell about men like me. I didn't want your pity. I wanted to not be the spectacle my limp makes. Then you didn't make a meal out of it. You just gave me a minute and let me be a man having a bad morning." "It took me too long to say thanks," Keir said. "You paid it forward at scale." And they both chuckled at the understatement. He almost asked Red about the limp's origin then. He didn't. People are stories that only open to the right knock. The knock came on a Sunday when neither of them were supposed to work. Keir was in line at the bakery pretending to be the sort of man who eats croissants without interrogating his choices when his phone rang. Unknown number, same area code. He answered because sometimes strangers have your next turn in them.
Keir's heart was a hand released from a fist. That night, he lay in bed and listened to the city in his pipes, the way water talks about where it's been. He thought of the first morning, of 50 seconds, of men who decide to build a wall not out of stone, but out of attention. He fell asleep wondering if attention was the only currency that mattered. It was the news that woke him the next day. Not a scandal, an obituary. Big Arn had died in his sleep, the way you hope men with knees that ache and shoulders that creak might get to go. The club posted a photo that made him look simultaneously mythic and human. A massive hand patting a dog that had misjudged and thought it was lap-sized. The caption said, "Ride in peace, Captain." The funeral procession the club organized was a geography lesson written in chrome. They rode past places Arn had loved, the pier where he fished for calm at dawn, the diner that overcooked bacon the way he liked it, the loop by the park where kids had gotten used to waving at the rumble. Keir parked his bus just off the route and stood with his hat off because someone had raised him to take his hat off for rituals. The convoy rolled by 2 abreast, and if a handful of eyes were damp, the rain could take the blame. Rhett paused near Keir long enough to make a sentence out of 3 words. "He taught me," he said. And then he rolled on, because grief is motion as much as it is stillness. In the weeks after, the convoy rode a little tighter, like a family that had recently remembered its edges are not invincible. Keir drove with a new alertness, as if part of honoring a man you didn't know well was doing your job in a way that would have made him nod. The last crisis came dressed as kindness gone sideways. A group of well-meaning activists decided to protect the protectors by forming a human chain at the Willow and 8th stop,
with matching shirts that said, "Ride with Love." And they stepped into the curb lane with the confidence of people who had practiced this on a whiteboard. The convoy arrived, found humans where it had expected fluid motion, and executed the sort of emergency choreography that keeps bodies intact at the expense of comfort and pride. There were words, not angry so much as misaligned. The activists wanted to be thanked. The riders wanted the road back to the manageable kind of unpredictable. Keir found himself in the odd position of mediating between two flavors of good intentions. He stepped down from the bus and held both hands up with the palms out, as if directing a choir that had begun two different songs. "I think," he said, "you all want the same thing in different fonts. Let's pick a typeface and print it." They laughed, because laughter is a good circuit breaker. He assigned activists to the sidewalk with signs and smiles, riders to the lane with engines and discipline, bus to its duty with a schedule and patience. They clapped for the nurses boarding. They clapped for the kids dragging two heavy backpacks. They clapped when a man with a walker took the ramp like a runway. The morning became a small festival heroes could attend without feeling like hypocrites. At the end of that day, a day that had not made the news and felt therefore like a success, Keir pulled the bus into its stall and sat staring at his hands. Rhett leaned in the doorway like punctuation. "You ever gonna take a day off?" Rhett asked. "Tomorrow," Keir said. "Liar," Rhett said, fond without admitting it. Keir smiled. "I don't know how to stop wanting to get people home." "That's not a thing you need to fix," Rhett said.
The next morning, when Keir reached Willow and 8th, the shelter wore a new addition, a small brass plaque that someone had affixed with the cooperation of a ladder and a belief in public art. It read, "This stop is kept by neighbors, thanks to the men who ride and the man who waits." Keir touched it with 2 fingers and then wiped rain off those fingers onto his pants leg, like he was embarrassed by the secular blessing. The convoy formed up. The bus kneeled for an old man who had finally decided to accept the ramp without drama. The day exhaled. Keir took them forward, the weight of a city briefly on his hands, and then not, because weight is only heavy if you carry it alone. At Halcyon, the cane woman paused, as had become their ritual. "You know," she said, "I used to think buses were just boxes. Now I think they're proof." "Of what?" Keir asked. "That some people show up and keep showing up," she said. "That's all the proof I ever asked for." He drove. The convoy rode. A patrol car shadowed at a distance that felt like agreement. The city made its daily bargain with motion and mercy and tried once again not to break it. That afternoon, Miss Pennington called him into her office with a face that refused to be a weather report. "2 things," she said. 1, they're naming you Employee of the Quarter whether you like it or not. You'll accept a framed certificate and clap for yourself in public." "Humiliating," he said, and she smiled. 2, she continued, "we've been given a pilot grant to install better lighting and bigger shelters along the reroute. Turns out when people notice one kind of safety, they start asking for the others." She slid a paper across the desk. "Pick 3 stops you think we forget about." He picked Dunlop, even though the route didn't technically pass it now, because maps are only as true as the people who draw them. He picked Willow and 8th because you honor origin stories even when they embarrass you. He picked Mercer because puddles shouldn't get to decide dignity. Pennington nodded. "Approved," she said. "I like your priorities." On his way out, he paused. "Thank you," he said. He meant for the write-up that first day, which had been delivered with a tone that had made room for him to still be proud of doing what he did next. She waved him away. "Go drive your bus," she said, which was her way of saying, "You're doing fine." The last minutes of the day are when cities become honest. Keir had learned to love that hour when lights decide to be necessary and the sky gives up the pretense of being helpful. He turned from Riverside onto the long straight that leads toward the depot. The convoy lifted 2 fingers as if at a benediction. The road hummed the song it sings to men who have kept their promises.
He saw in his mirror a small movement out of rhythm, a sedan darting, a young driver's sudden decision, a bicycle with a blinking tail light where it did not belong at that instant. He felt his body prepare. He saw Rhett move in the corner of his eye, the practiced shift of weight, the line change that writes a sentence invisibly between machines. The sedan thought better. The bicycle found the curb and then the sidewalk, and then breath in a chest that realized it had held itself for too long. The bus rolled on, a whale among dolphins, aware, careful, middle-aged and unembarrassed by it. At the depot, Keir shut down the bus with the reverence you give a tool you love. He sat a minute longer than necessary. Rhett's shadow filled the door. "Tomorrow?" he asked, casual as gravity. "Tomorrow," Keir said. He started to step down and stopped because his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from a number saved months ago. "City Council wants to do a proclamation. Ask you and, if he'll permit it, the man who waited. You free Thursday?" Keir groaned. Rhett smirked. "I'll buy the coffee," Rhett said, which was not an answer, but was exactly the right answer. They walked out together into the kind of evening that made the harbor look honest. The wind smelled like salt and metal, and something sweet from a food truck that had learned a new recipe. The city they loved had not become perfect. It had become, on this route, in this hour, good enough to keep trying. 200, Keir said, watching the last of the bikes ghost away down the boulevard. Rhett shrugged. "Some days more, some days less. Doesn't matter." He tilted his head toward the shelter at Willow and 8th, barely visible down the line of lights. "That's where it matters." Keir thought of 50 seconds. He thought of the weight of a hand on your elbow at the edge of a curb. He thought of the sound of a horn turning back into a machine that means no harm. He thought, "I can keep doing this." The road answered in its way with a breath he could feel through his feet. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.